On today's Locked On Jayhawks, is Kansas a better or worse team without KJ Adams?
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on? Derek Johnson here. This is Locked On Jayhawks. Thanks for making it your first listen every day. Thank you to the everydayers catching each and every show. Apologies for not having a KU K-State recap, dealing with some stomach bug, but you can find us here anywhere you get your podcasts, including on our YouTube page. And we're going to get into, on today's episode, takeaways from no KJ Adams in the KU basketball game against Kansas State, pros and cons of what it looked like for KU. We're also going to get into a little bit more on longer term. Bill Self said that he's not going to play against TCU, what that means for that matchup as well. And I wanted to touch a little bit on Zeke Mayo and how much of a baller he's been for KU to this point of the season. Today's episode of the show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started today. So Kansas takes down Kansas State. No KJ Adams. It was a game that Kansas started, as good as they've really started all year, up 14-0. And then, from there, I thought Kansas State actually played a pretty good game the rest of the way to only lose by 10. Kansas is winning 84-74 in the end. And obviously the big storyline coming into this one for KU was that KJ Adams wasn't going to play. And what was that going to mean for Kansas, for a player that has been very divisive, a player that has been very polarizing for KU fans, a player that has, been, you could argue, the best defender on KU, but also has led to certain issues with the spacing that, some people would say, oh, I like KJ when he plays, but I'd like him to play less minutes. Others are more extreme with it, right? So it's been very polarizing in that sense. And I think we saw a little bit of pros and cons from both. Now, I will say, of course we are. We're going to learn more the more games that this goes on without KJ Adams, which they're not going to have in the TCU game. We'll see what it goes from there, right? If you end up with a 4 or 5 game sample size of games without KJ Adams, that will be a much better judgment of where they are better, where they are worse. Overall, what does this mean? Overall, should this mean he's playing less minutes? Those sort of things. I think there will be better takeaways for that once we get more games into it. But let's start putting the pieces of the puzzle together, because this will be one of those first pieces. And the first piece, I think, is very simple. The offense looked better. The defense looked worse, okay? So let's get into some pros and cons of KU not having KJ in this game. And that first pro is overall the offense. Yes, it did look better for KU. You look at on the season, points per possession. So, factoring out tempo and that sort of thing, not just straight points, right? They scored 99 points against UCF, but in the UCF game, there was, more opportunities in terms of possessions. They played 77 possessions in the UCF game to score 99 points. In the Kansas State game, it was 64 possessions to score 84 points. So it's kind of a lower tempo game, but they still put up 84 points. By points per possession, that was Kansas's best game of the season. They shot 55% from the floor, which is great. They shot 38% from three, which is great. And if you look at it, the points per possession, if we said points per 100 possessions, Kansas had 131 points per 100 possessions against Kansas State. That just edged out the Furman game, which was 130, and the UCF game, which was 128 for the most for Kansas this season. So it's again, tough to extract how much, is just a one-game sample size. I also think it is important to remember, as much as I'm bringing this stuff up, it is important to know who you went up against. Right now, Kansas State ranks 111th in the country in defensive efficiency. And so far this season, Kansas State is allowing teams, to shoot 49% on twos, 36% on threes. They have not been a good defense so far this season. So that is important to know too, that it's possible if KJ Adams was in the game, KU still would have had a good offensive game, right? But it was their best of the season, right? So it's easy to look to that and say one of the big pros of not having him was there was more spacing. There were more offensive-geared, offensive-minded players in the game at different points of time. You did still play Flory Badunga a good amount of minutes, though, and that wouldn't necessarily apply there. But still, that was a good start for them on the offensive end without KJ. And I think the biggest areas you saw that different in space, it felt like there was more space for Hunter, which, again, like I said, is a little weird because how much more space was there really if you're playing Flory Badunga out there for such big minutes? I don't know. Maybe there wasn't that much more, but maybe it's the threat of Flory as an offensive rebounder or as a dunk target. Like KJ gets dunks too, but I feel like with Flory, it's a different level with the athleticism. But with Hunter, I mean, 25 points, 12 of 19, and he didn't have to shoot a single three against Kansas State. And that one right there is the one that kind of pulls me and is like, oh, he didn't have to stretch out if he didn't have to. You know what I mean? I don't know. Maybe I'm overlooking at that. Maybe he just decided not to take one or didn't get the look he wanted to. But did you know this was just the second time in Big 12 games that Hunter Dickinson has shot better than 45% in a game? 45% is not like a high watermark for centers. Like you want your centers shooting about 50%. And that's just the second time in a Big 12 game. So like, I think having the extra spacing certainly helped him. But then again, in the back of my head, I'm like, but they were playing Flory. How much more spacing was there, you know? So I think that's difficult to kind of wrap your head around. I think you'd probably say the same for DeJuan Harris. Like, were there more space in the lanes for DeJuan Harris? Is that a big reason why he had 15 points on 6 of 9? Because it felt like a lot of his shots were the shots around the rim and layups. And maybe he had more space to operate out there. And maybe all of those things contributed to why they had such a good offensive performance, in addition to obviously Zeke Mayo just, being an unbelievable shooter and scorer for KU. It also led to, I think, another good pro for this one was more playing time for others. We saw Flory Badunga end up with 25 minutes, which, for a young center, you're looking to progress along. Like, those minutes, I think, are so valuable. He ended up with a solid game, 6 points, 9 rebounds. He had a block, 2 assists, did Flory. But, it was good to see him out there and everything. And I think that lineup continues to look good when Badunga is next to Hunter. You got to see AJ Storr for 17 minutes, which, it doesn't sound like a lot, but that's actually his highest total in Big 12 games. He had 7 points in the 17 minutes. I thought he looked pretty good overall in those 17 minutes. I thought he did a pretty, good job. The difficulty of Coleman Hawkins was that for Flory, maybe he was more experienced than him, whereas with Storr, he was a little bit bigger than him. But I thought Storr did a good job, like, containing him in terms of his mobility. But yeah, so you saw at least more minutes than you're used to for Storr by not having KJ, and then you did at least get to see like another handful of minutes for Keith Passmore, who at least got a shot out there, though it wasn't really able to capitalize, I guess I would say. Now, as far as the cons for not having KJ Adams out there, I don't know that you really did, and this is kind of piggybacking off that last one. Like, there were some more opportunities for guys like Flory and AJ Storr. I don't know that there were as many other opportunities or as many minutes to go around for those other players as we thought there were going to be, right? Initially, you look on paper, and it's KJ's playing 28, 29 minutes per game. It would be, okay, this is going to go to AJ Storr and Ryland Griffin and these guys. And what we mostly ended up just seeing was it just mostly went to the other starters. Like, Flory got a big amount of minutes boost, right? He went up to 25. But this was just a game where DeJuan played 36, Zeke played 36, Hunter played 34, Shaquille Moore played 31. So it's not even that you saw a lot of KJ's minutes go to the backups, and that Bill Self was using this as, hey, this is my opportunity to give a bigger runway for, AJ Storr, Ryland Griffin. It was just like, oh, I'm just going to continue to give it to the guys I trust and just add on to their minutes even more. And so, yes, AJ Storr did have his conference high for minutes, but for the season, he's averaging 17 minutes per game. So is that his season average? The Ryland Griffin one is the big head scratcher here, right? 12 minutes, 0 shots recorded for Ryland Griffin. The hopeful part of my mind is that this was just about, okay, K-State's playing a lot of these two big lineups where Coleman Hawkins is in at the 4. And if you're playing Ryland Griffin, a lot of times in this lineup, he would be in as the 4. I don't know if you want him guarding that. Whereas a lot of other teams are playing more 6'6", 6'7" wings at the 4, and that's more doable for Ryland Griffin. So my hope is that it was just viewed as a bad matchup, and that moving forward, you're going to see Ryland Griffin. I think Ryland Griffin should be playing 20, 25 minutes a game. I think he really opens up the floor spacing-wise, three-point shooting. So that was the certainly biggest head scratcher with that. And then the other part of it is like, if you said, Ryland Griffin was going to actually be down to 12 minutes and Storr was going to be at 17, which is like whatever, you would have been like, did David Coit get a lot of the minutes? And it was like, no, he only played 3. So ironically, no KJ Adams mostly led to Bill Self giving more minutes to just the other starters and not those extra guys. We'll see if that continues. But that would be a con if that does continue, because I think this is an opportunity to, give those guys a little bit more leeway. And then the last one I would say here is just like, I don't know that I view this as a con, but it's definitely not a pro. Like, I don't think you can come away from that game and be like, Kansas just definitively looked better in that game than their other games. Like, you could say, again, their offense looked better. And again, stats would show that was the case. But I could also point to the fact that Kansas State, again, has not been good defensively this year. Kansas State in Big 12 only games is 15th of 16 teams in points allowed or in defensive efficiency. So like, again, the offense looked good. I thought it did, but you can point to that. And we're going to learn more in these upcoming games because of that, right? You could also say that the KU defense was not good, and the stats would back that up. This was KU's worst defensive game by points allowed per possession. K-State shot 46%. They had only 5 turnovers. And so even though this was KU's number 1 most efficient offensive game of the season, it was their worst defensive efficient game of the season. They gave up 115.5 points per 100 possessions. The next closest was North Carolina. That was 115. Creighton was 108. Duke was 106, and so on down the list. So I say all this to say the offense looked better, but the defense looked worse. And it almost feels like to me that it's like you're pulling one end of the thread and then another thread's coming out. So maybe there's a happy medium here of maybe the idea is, hey, if you play KJ less, your offense will boost up, but you'll still have, once he comes back, that defensive guy who can go out there just for less minutes than he's playing now. I don't know that that's how Bill Self will see it, but we will wait and see on that. But I want to get into a little bit about this TCU game and kind of moving forward, because I think there's some interesting stuff there. Because the question is ultimately going to be, how can you blend this enough when KJ is back and mix the defense with the offense. And again, it is just a 1-game sample size, but right now it kind of feels like you're in this weird standstill of, do you want to be an offensive team or defensive team? Can you find a way to like be in the middle ground of a little bit of both? This episode of the show is brought to you by Prize Picks, the place to get real money sports action. With over 10 million members and billions in winnings, Prize Picks has changed the game in daily fantasy sports. Whether it's the playoffs or regular season, Prize Picks has made it easier than ever to win big while enjoying all the football action. Now it's playoff time, and there's no better way to get in on the action than with Prize Picks. Here's how it works. You simply pick more or less on at least 2 players, and if your picks hit, you could win up to 1,000 times your cash. That's right, 1,000 times your money just by making a few simple picks. You can get Travis Kelce more receiving yards. You can get DeAndre Hopkins more receiving yards. You can get in on the college basketball action for KU, TCU as well, and put it together with different sports if you want. It's fun to predict, easy to play, plus with Prize Picks Flex Play, you can still double your money even if one of your picks doesn't hit. And with the app, you get your winnings fast, sometimes in as little as 15 minutes. Ready to run your game this football season? Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONCollege to get $50 off instantly after you play, or to get $50, instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's right, $50 just for playing. Don't wait, take your game to the next level with Prize Picks. Prize Picks, run your game. Continuing on this episode of Locked On Jayhawks, thanks for making your first listen every day. Don't forget to check out Locked On College Football for tonight with the national championship coming at you tonight. Okay, so Bill Self in the post game after the K-State game said that KJ Adams is not going to be available against TCU. And when we first talked about this, like, I wasn't really expecting him to play in this game. I feel like with the week-to-week, with the separated shoulder, like, to me, that seems like he's going to be out. And he kind of went more in detail, did Self, and made it seem like that would be the case. Like, it could be, 5 games without KJ Adams. And I think that makes sense when you look at the TCU game and then you look at Houston next. Like, you're not going to have a guy who has a separated shoulder go play like one of the most physical teams in the country who plays good defense and stuff. And I think that creates what to me becomes the most interesting dynamic here. So when you look at TCU on the season, this is a team who just won at Baylor on Sunday night. They're sitting at 10-7 on the season. They haven't been particularly good on offense, but they have been good on defense. They're a top 30 team in the country on the defensive end of the court. So from the standpoint of KU's offense looked as good as it had all season long against K-State, but the defense looked as worse as it had all season long against K-State, which maybe that was just K-State was having a good game, even though they weren't shooting threes well. You could point to this upcoming matchup with TCU and say, okay, if the offense looks good again now against TCU without KJ, then it's easier to be like, no, the offense is just better, without him, with this other lineup. And the proof is that they did well against TCU, as opposed to saying of course they did well against a K-State team that's been bad on defense. You know what I mean? And it's the same thing with Houston, except to another level upcoming over the weekend. Houston is the number 1 defense in defensive efficiency on KenPom. So like, if your offense looks decent in these next 2 games against top 30 defenses, the number 1 defense in the country, then all of a sudden you're in a situation where you're going to come away from this saying, yeah, they are better on that end of the court. But You still have to figure out the defensive end. You have to figure out overall, and it'll be interesting as well for the TCU game because that's a team who typically, good athleticism, crashes the glass, gets to the free throw line under Jamie Dixon, and you have to worry about foul trouble with Flory. So, like, that's somewhere else that you could miss KJ in this game. Just having another body who can absorb fouls and keep Flory from being in the foul trouble, which he got 4 of them against Kansas State. And to that notion, like, I do think the reaction with KJ being out versus TCU, I will be interested to see what Bill Self's starting lineup is, because this is something we talked about before the K-State game. We said, would they really start Flory? Like, I think that would be Bill Self's preferred lineup with Flory next to Hunter, but would it make sense to start them when you don't, right? Zach Clements is injured right now. You don't have another, if KJ and Zach are both injured, you don't have another, scholarship big man on the roster. Would you risk having a freshman who struggled avoiding fouls with Flory next to Hunter in the starting lineup? And the answer was yes against Kansas State. But I wonder how much of that was matchup dependent. Again, they're playing 2 big men. Coleman Hawkins, who's 6'10", is basically their 4-man, right? And then you got David Gasson as their 5-man. I do wonder with TCU, who has more at the wing, it's like 6'7", 6'8", more traditional 4-men, 3-men types. I wonder if this matchup, they would say, okay, because of that, we're going to have Flory come off the bench, and we're going to mostly play with, wings at the 4 position. Or if they don't, I wonder if it gets taken out of Bill Self's hand. Like, there's a very real possibility where they do start Flory next to Hunter, and Flory gets in foul trouble, or Hunter gets in foul trouble, and then you have to basically play one center the rest of the way. And then you're basically stuck with playing, AJ Storr, Rylan Griffin at the 4 position, or Rakeese Passmore at the 4 position. And then there's not really another choice for Bill Self because you start running out of options there. So I think that'll be very interesting to monitor and very interesting to track against a TCU team who really crashes the glass, like I said, and that can lead to, over the backs or fouls or whatever it is. I think they out-rebounded Baylor 41-25. And this year they haven't gotten to the line as much, but again, traditionally with Jamie Dixon, like, that's been something that they've done at a very high rate. And so I think it'll be very fun on Wednesday night to see what some of these lineups and rotations end up being for KU. If they build off what they did on Saturday, if it's completely different, and what the offense and defense looks like with or without KJ, if it can kind of back up what we saw against Kansas State, or if it was more about the opponent on both ends of the floor and upcoming from here. All right, we're going to finish up. I want to talk a little bit about Zeke Mayo, who has been unbelievable in home games for KU and really all season long for the Jayhawks. So we're going to talk about his performance against Kansas State and what he's doing so far this season. This is Locked On Jayhawks. And today's episode of the show is brought to you by FanDuel. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. That's $300 to keep the action going. The FanDuel app is easy to navigate, and the variety of bets keeps every game exciting. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. No waiting around for your winnings, whether you're betting on your favorite team or just looking to add some extra excitement for the playoffs. FanDuel has you covered. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $300 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Finishing things up on this episode of the show, and we'll be back with a KU-TCU preview on Wednesday. We'll have a KU Houston preview coming up later in the week, and some other content coming at you here with Locked On Jayhawks throughout the week. So make sure to subscribe to the show anywhere you get your podcast or on our YouTube page. So Zeke Mayo has been awesome this year. Had another big game in the Kansas State performance with, over 20 points. Had a great start to the game where he's just hitting threes left and right. And that was something we brought up before the game, that he's, played well at home, and he was going to be, the local kid who maybe he's grown up with more personal experiences of Kansas State fans, that he cares more about the rivalry than, player Y or whatever. Right. But he ends up having a big game. And now on the season, in games that he is playing in Allen Fieldhouse right now, of course, they want to get the numbers up on the road too. I think he's down to 10 points per game on the road, but he's up to 17.7 points per game at home. And to put into perspective how good he has been this season, specifically if we want to talk about these Allen Fieldhouse games, he in home games for KU, 17.7 points per game, 4.8 rebounds per game, 3 assists per game. He is shooting 51% from the floor. He's shooting 42.5% from three. He's shooting 88% at the free throw line. He's already had 6 games of 20 or more points. All of them have come at home this season. Devonte Graham senior season when he was an All-American. Now, obviously, he had a bunch of assist numbers too. But if we just want to look at the scoring and shooting perspective, Devonte Graham averaged 17.3 points per game his final season at Kansas on 40.6% from three. And obviously, Devonte Graham was a great player for KU that is probably going to get his jersey hanging in the rafters at Allen Fieldhouse. That basically means, 17.3 points versus 17.7. 41% from three versus 43% from three, if we round up. That basically means that in just the games in Allen Fieldhouse, the home games, Kansas basically has Devonte Graham on their team. Like that's basically the equivalent of what you're talking about here, just in the home games right now. But that is a lethal pairing when you're pairing that with Hunter Dickinson, who is so good on the block, in the post, and scoring down low. That's a really fun duo and really exciting when they both get going and those two-man actions on the offensive end of the court. And I go back to the offseason. Like I know a lot of people. I thought this was kind of dumb when it happened. Like they were in, but I understood why it was happening. Right, people were scarred, people were hurt. You brought in Nick Timberlake the year before, had big numbers at a non-Power 5 university, and you saw this guy who was putting up points and scoring and shooting at a high rate. And some people who hadn't really seen Zeke Mayo play just saw the same thing. Like, oh, guy from a lower level conference who can be a good shooter, but that didn't work with Timberlake. We're sure it's going to work with Mayo. When in reality, it couldn't be further from the truth about how different their games were, about how much Zeke impacted winning at his previous stop, about how the different variety and abilities of Zeke to get those shots off, and how he did play in some high level games in the non-con and, in NCAA tournaments and stuff. I always thought it was dumb that those were ever compared to begin with. But I think now it's a good reminder that, like, you don't always have to get your best transfers from other power schools. And then maybe this will be a good thing for Bill Self too, because you get spurned a few times too many, then you're not going to want to go back to that well. And it is funny. I don't know, maybe not funny. We're not laughing about it, right? But it is a little bit ironic that among all the transfers that Bill Self brought in, Shaquille Moore's been really good here for KU these past couple of weeks. But the guy who has hit the most and has cleared the bar the most has been Zeke Mayo. And the guys who have been, not quite lived up to the expectations of what you were going to get from them in the offseason have been the guys coming from other power schools. And so I think it is a good reminder you don't always have to go for like one over the other. Just keep that in mind for future ads, right? When we get to this next offseason and we're talking about portal targets, we're talking about portal additions, it doesn't always have to be from this school or from this winning team or doing this or that. There's a lot of different ways that you can do it. There's a lot of ways to skin a cat, so to speak. And Zeke Mayo's had an awesome year for KU. It's been a lot of fun to watch. That'll do it for this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. You can find our show anywhere you get your podcast, including on our YouTube page. We'll see you next time with LOJ.